Hello and welcome to this Oak Tree English video comparing teaching philosophies. This is in part to satisfy the rigours of my debt course. Today I'm going to talk about something which may be interesting for teachers. I'm going to discuss the development of learning theory. I'll first give a brief overview, then compare two philosophies, and then we will see how they can be applied to your classroom. So let's make a start. Sadly, we have neither the time nor inclination to go all the way back to Plato's Academy or Aristotle. So we're only going to look at the last century and a bit. We'll go back to the 1800s, which was broadly when functionalism gave way to behaviourism. This was particularly under the influence of a new wave of psychology under famous names such as Pavlov and his dogs. Pavlov showed that by reinforcing certain desired behaviours with food and dissuading undesired behaviour with pain, that he could educate his dogs to behave in the way he wished. This came out of a belief that situations, such as heights or proximity to spiders, do not create the associated phobias, but rather the involuntary psychological reaction that accompany these phenomena. So theoretically, as Scott Thornbury puts it, habits are formed when the learner's responses to external stimuli are positively reinforced. This came into language learning as audiolingualism, or drilling. In 1938, B.F. Skinner added his support to this theory. There's B.F. Skinner, and moved it forward with operant conditioning. Ooh. This theory regarded the human mind as basically a tabula rasa, which could be programmed as desired, a blank sheet on which to write. He tested his theories on rats in an environment, the Skinner box, where food is released on the activation of certain levers. Unlike Pavlov, he didn't advocate any form of punishment for bad behaviour. A reaction against this came from a fellow American, Noam Chomsky, who proposed a model which he called mentalism. Chomsky said that language learning was a different process than the ones tested by Skinner and Pavlov and a chap called Watson, and had to be studied differently. He proposed that language was innate, filling a built-in universal grammar, and its acquisition, rather than mere habit forming, is more analytical, generative, and creative. Mentalism was a callback towards a Cartesian view of the mind, which emphasized rationalism. René Descartes was the one who said, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. A harmonizing of these theories, well, there's a quote reference for you at the bottom there. A harmonizing of these theories gave rise to a group of cognitive models. There's another reference for you. Bye-bye, Chomsky. Hello, cognitivism. That's quite difficult to say. Cognitivism, there it is, highlights the use of scaffolding and collaborative learning. The key figures in this field were a chap called Jean Piaget, there he is, and another chap called Jerome Bruner, who we won't discuss. It moved the discussion forward from beasts, rats and dogs, to children. Piaget focused heavily on childhood development, identifying 4 educational stages in development. His arguments can be applied to adulthood too, given that we assume that adults are children who have reached formal operations. His central theme was that a learner will gain new information which reshapes their current knowledge so that it can be reformed within new situations. This is all fine, but his research methodology has been critiqued for using too small a sample, and it rests on assumptions about a majority of children, which is not sufficiently flexible to encompass all of humanity. Mentalism and cognitivism moved the field towards humanistic models. So there's Immanuel Kant's reference there for you. Such as constructivism. Where mentalism drew from the thoughts of René Descartes, so humanistic constructivism draws from the work of Immanuel Kant, hence last reference, whose critique of pure reason, which I just gave, suggests that there are 2 realities, the objective and the subjective. In treating the student as an individual who creates their own reality, the teacher merely creates the environment wherein students can discover how language works for themselves. In certain cultures, who do not share the Western post-Enlightenment fetish for individualism and maintain a more social, collectivist philosophy, a related approach called social constructivism could be employed. This includes socio-cultural learning theory, championed by Lev Vygotsky, out of the USSR, as was. While this agrees with Chomsky's mentalism in terms of advocating learning in a social context, it denies the concept of a prefabricated universal grammar. In latter years, constructivism is beginning to be adapted into constructionism. Here is a reference that I used from a website, the difference between constructivism and constructionism. This would include Michael Lewis's lexical approach, which I'll talk about at the end. This challenges some basic assumptions, such as that language consists of grammaticalized lexis, as opposed to lexicalized grammar. I'll talk about it later. The luminary of constructionism is Seymour Papert. There's Michael Lewis. There he is. Seymour Papert, a South African mathematician and computer scientist who said, "The role of the teacher is to create the conditions for invention rather than provide ready-made knowledge." I probably should have done that in a South African accent, but I couldn't do that without being wildly offensive to all South Africans. He sees learning as being deeply contextualized and suggests a holistic approach which engages the whole being, mind, body, and emotions. This includes understanding preferred learning styles and incorporating this into a reactive and personalized schema. So this has been a very rough introduction to the history of learning theories and approaches, which I hope sets a backdrop to the rest of this presentation. I will compare 2 of these models from either end of the timeline, namely the behaviorist model, specifically that of B.F. Skinner, and constructionism of Seymour Papert, to show how far we have progressed in the teaching profession. From my perspective, the major weakness of behaviorism is that it was based on the learning of lower animals, like Pavlov's dogs and Skinner's rats. By the time we get to Papert, the realization has dawned on the teaching profession that our students are human. This may sound flippant, but it is an assumption of the scientific era, that we are merely beasts evolved to a higher order, which has, in the last decade or so, significantly reduced in scholarly discussions of the human condition. This is why people like Richard Dawkins are no longer taken particularly seriously. Note that scientistic here is not the same as scientific. Behaviourism tried to introduce science to learning, but did so against a Victorian progressivist backdrop which assumed that science was the only criteria for consideration. While science is an important discipline, it's only one tool for determining truth or building a workable model. It's also worth pointing out that all sciences are in their infancy in comparison to what there is to know. This is supported, of course, by Socrates. Wisest is he who knows that he knows nothing. That's a quote I drew from Sophie's World, which is my level of philosophy. By the way, a fantastic book. Quoted the reference at the bottom there, which I'm about to take off and replace with Shakespeare. Because in Hamlet, Shakespeare wrote, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than you can dream of in your philosophy." That's a quote I meditate on frequently. Another point of conflict is that behaviourism relies on a collectivist mentality where all people are expected to learn in precisely the same way, while constructionism values an individualistic approach, which appreciates different learning styles and preferences. It also involves not only mental processes in the learning experience, but also emotional stimuli. In recognizing that each person is the author of their own reality, following from Kantian constructivism, we teachers are able to shape that reality to some degree by providing appropriate and helpful stimuli. Much of this I took from a psychology textbook. Feel free to either look it up or completely ignore it. My personal philosophical bent owes more to Descartes than Kant. I once even toyed with the idea of getting cogito ergo sum tattooed around my upper arm. My mother wisely dissuaded me from that course of action. For this reason, I would seek to syncretize Cartesian mentalism and Kantian constructivism within the framework of constructionism. Within my discipline of language acquisition, specifically English as a foreign language, I find the work of Michael Lewis very helpful. The lexical approach replaces the present practice produce procedure with a more holistic observe, hypothesize, experiment model. This gives space for more of the affective factors which make students take ownership of the learning and place the language within their own created reality. Rather than teaching grammar and vocabulary distinctly, I'd seek to teach them together in an integrated formulation within a subject which the class already has an interest in. I'm a firm believer in CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, whereby language is taught through another subject, such as art history or philosophy. I particularly enjoy philosophy, as you may have noticed. The observe, hypothesis, experiment cycle also allows for more mistakes to arise. I go to some lengths to vocalize to my students that mistakes are good, since they are the media by which learning can transpire, though I rarely use those words in class. Earlier models, including behavioural and humanist models, tended to view mistakes as bad. But since language can only be learned through the making of mistakes, my classes regard mistakes as good. This way, students produce both successful language, which does the job, and accurate language, without the negative emotions of having been berated for producing inexact grammar. This concludes my presentation, which I hope has covered a historical and thematic overview of a range of theories. I hope it's compared behaviourism from the early part of the 20th century and constructionism from the early part of the 21st century. I hope I've shown the development of thought and also shown how this understanding impacts my own teaching philosophy. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please remember to like, share and subscribe to Oak Tree English. Thank you.